Welcome! I'm Delisa, and I'm going to share with you my studies. Um, what I'm studying today is Institute for Biblical and Scientific Studies on the biblical archaeology, the date of the Exodus according to ancient writers. So this is a little bit some more perspective on the Exodus from primary sources like Josephus and Herodotus and many more. So let's start this with the introduction. This book is a result of my dissertation entitled The Date of the Exodus in Ancient Writings. The first chapter deals with three major groups of ancient writers. Firstly, ancient Jewish writers will be considered that especially mention chronology concerning the Exodus. Secondly, ancient secular writers that gave opinions about the origins of the Jews will be considered. Finally, a look at the early church fathers that constructed chronologies of the Old Testament. One of the most important considerations is what the biblical writers themselves said about the date of the Exodus. Chapter 2 will consider both the Old and New Testament writers concerning the Exodus. The last chapter will focus on the archaeological evidence that has been found that best fits into the chronology of the Exodus. The most important discovery is the Memepta stela that mentions Israel, which forced the revision of a number of liberal theories. I just would like to stop and point out that this author is, or these various different historians and authors are going to expose different things other than just the archaeological date of the Exodus, or dates, because there's a lot of different dates, I believe, here, but they're all from primary sources, and I think some dates get changed because of the thing called a pesher from the Talmud, where dates are really kind of skewed in there, and then I'm not sure about other places as well, but I'm wondering. So let's move on, and we'll see what else this exposes besides the date of the Exodus. I think there's quite a bit here, but I may skip over some things. The purpose of this paper is to show that most of the ancient writers equated the Exodus and the expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt around 1570 to 50 BC. to 1550 BC. Most ancient writers put the Jews in Egypt for 215 years or less. All took the 400 or 430 years to cover the time in Egypt and Canaan. The most counted the 400 years from the birth of Isaac or Abraham's entry into the land of Canaan. None of the ancient writers, including the Apostle Paul and the Jews, were in Egypt for 430 years. So none of the ancient writers, including the Apostle Paul, said the Jews were in Egypt for 430 years. Finally, the archaeological evidence will be considered that best fits with the chronology of the Exodus. This paper will demonstrate that the best explanation of the evidence is that the Jews were in Egypt at the time of the Hyksos. The expulsion of the Hyksos should be equated with the Exodus from Egypt in the Bible. One of the major stumbling blocks for the conservative is their understanding of the 480 years from the founding of the temple to the Exodus. This number does not include the 111 years of oppression in the book of Judges that ancient writers, including their totals. The evidence from the Sinai best puts the wanderings in the wilderness during the Middle Bronze Age. The conquest of Canaan is best to be equated with the destructions at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. From Egyptian topographical lists around 1480 BC, the Amarna letters tell about the Hapiru, who seem to be the Hebrews during the time of the Judges. The name Israel seems to be a late word used to describe the League of 12 tribes that later became the nation of Israel. The name Israel seems to be a late word used to describe the League of 12 tribes. Liberal scholars place Israel in Canaan around the 13th century BC, while conservative scholars place Israel in Canaan at 1406 BC. Conclusions seem to be wrong according to archaeological evidence and ancient writers, which will be demonstrated in these coming chapters. Okay. So we're going to look at ancient writers and what they said about this. There are three main groups of writers that need to be considered. Firstly, the Jewish writers who interpret 430 years of Egypt and the chronology of the Exodus. Secondly, secular writers who tell about the origins of the Jews. And finally, the chronologies of early church fathers concerning the Exodus. We kind of want to skip that. Go right to Josephus, the Jewish historian. Josephus, who lived at the time of Christ, wrote The Antiquity of the Jews, The Jewish War, and Against Apion. In his book, The Antiquity of the Jews, Josephus interprets the 430 years of Exodus, 1240, as starting with Abraham's entrance into Canaan and ending at the Exodus. Josephus states, quote, "They left Egypt in the month Xanthicus on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt. 1830, 59, book 2000, whatever. This follows the Septuagint LXX reading of Exodus 1240, which says, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, was 430 years." And Whiston, in his notes on Josephus, is puzzled by the Masoretic text that leaves out Canaan, when Masoretic chronology clearly shows that Israel only stayed half of the 430 years in Egypt. 1830, 59. Good to know, but I'm not going to be looking that up. So, in the Antiquity of the Jews, 1830, Josephus says the Exodus occurred 592 years before the Temple of Solomon was built, which is about 960 BC. So the Exodus, according to Josephus, was about 1552 BC, or 1020 years from Abraham's entry into Canaan in Against Apion. In Against Apion, Josephus says the Exodus was 612 years before the temple. This difference is probably due to the counting of the years of the judges. Okay, well, not really. This isn't the part I wanted. This place, the Exodus, is about the same time as the expulsion of the Hyksos. The entrance into Egypt was 215 years before the Exodus, which would be about 1767 BC. This date is close to the beginning of the second intermediate period in Egypt, when the Hyksos rose to power. The Hyksos were considered foreign rulers of Lower Egypt. Their capital was Avaris, which was later named Pi-Ramesses. 1 Kings 6:1 states that the Exodus was 480 years before the Temple of Solomon was built. Yet Josephus clearly states 592 years in his book, The Antiquity of the Jews. The difference seems to be in the ways the rule of the judges were calculated. Josephus seems to include the oppressions as well as the judges, whereas the writer of Kings excludes the rule of oppressors, as was customary at this time. Well, that's because there were two different records. One was taken by the Yahwists, and the other one, Kings, is the Elohists. Different. They worship different gods, as was customary at this time. This amounts to about 111 years difference. Okay, none of this is what I'm really looking at. Josephus, in his book, Against Apion, argues that the Jews are of great antiquity, going back some 5,000 years. The further back your ancestry went, the greater the wisdom and respect for you you'd received. Josephus quotes a number of secular historians to prove his point. Josephus quotes Manetho, who wrote a history of Egypt. Josephus says, Manetho has granted us one fact. He has admitted that our race, the Jews, was not of Egyptian origin, but came into Egypt from elsewhere, conquered it, and afterwards left it. And source. Manetho identifies Israel with the Hyksos, which were expelled by Ahmose from Egypt, which could be Moses from Egypt. Josephus quotes Manetho describing this expulsion by saying, "Then the kings of Thebaid and of the rest of Egypt rose in revolt against the shepherds, Hyksos, and a great way broke out, which was of long duration, under a king named Misphramothus. The shepherds, he says, were defeated, driven out of all the rest of Egypt, and confined in a place called Araras, containing 10,000 aurori. The shepherds, according to Manetho, enclosed the whole area with a great strong wall in order to secure all their possessions and spoils. Thumosis, the son of Misphagomothosis, he continues, invested the walls with an army of 480,000 men and endeavored to reduce them to submission by siege. Despairing of achieving his object, he concluded a treaty under which they were all to evacuate Egypt and go whither they would, unmolested. Upon these terms, no fewer than 240,000 entire households with their possessions left Egypt and traversed the desert to Syria. Then, terrified by the might of the Assyrians, who at that time were the masters of Asia, they built a city in the country now called Judea, capable of accommodating their vast company, and gave it the name of Jerusalem. And that's from Against Apion. And there's the book, Manetho, and there's the source. Later, Josephus quotes Manetho again, saying, after the departure of the pastoral people from Egypt to Jerusalem, Thutmosis the king, who expelled them from Egypt, there's the word Moses again. These could all be the same people, and different sources call him something different. So, excuse me. Thutmosis is a corrupt form of Amos. Oh, didn't know they were going to say that now. And so they apparently are thinking these are the same person also, who expelled the Hyksos. In the other passage quoted above, Misphagomothosis, who is Thutmose the third, is that King Tut, is said to drive them out along with his son Thutmose the fourth. I don't know which one's the classic King Tut. This must be a misquote for Africanus. Eusebius and Tatian all quote Manetho saying Amos expelled the Hyksos. Okay, well, then Moses led the Hyksos out of Egypt. Maybe. From Manetho, Josephus calculates the Exodus as 393 years before Danaeus. Okay, we know Dan. That's for another video. Arrived in Argos about 1290 BC, which would place the Exodus at 1683 BC and 1,000 years before the Trojan War. 1186 BC, 1920. Against Apion, and that's from Against Apion. The 1,000 years seems to be a round, exaggerated number that is unreliable or a mistake of the Trojan War for the first Olympiad, 776 BC. For in Eusebius it is only 400 plus years from the Trojan War and 10,020 years from the first Olympiad, which is almost a complete cycle. Excuse me, 524, 533, I don't know that source. I'm not going to read all these sources. From Phoenician history, Josephus proves that the Temple of Solomon was built 143 years and 8 months earlier than the foundation of Carthage by the Tyrians, 814 BC, Against Apion. This would put the building of the temple at 957 BC, which seems to be a very accurate date. Josephus also mentions Chaeremon, who wrote a history of Egypt, which tells about a contaminated people, the Jews, being exiled from Egypt by Amenophis. When the Jews reached the border of Egypt, they united with other exiles, but we denied permission to leave, so they marched back against Egypt. Amenophis fled to Ethiopia, where Ramesses was born, another name similar to Moses. Ra Moses, was born in a cave. When Ramesses reached manhood to drive out the Jew, he drove the Jews out of Egypt into Syria, and that's from Against Apion. Another writer, okay, you have to wonder why all these people, their sources were burned, and this may be why, because there are no surviving manuscripts by Apion. You have to get his quotes directly from Josephus. So another writer, Lysimachus, said that because the Jews were afflicted with leprosy and other diseases, King Bocchus deported them excuse me, to the wilderness, where Moses led them to Jerusalem. This is not Bocchus of the 24th dynasty, but a much older Bocchus. Is that like Bacchus in the Torah? As mentioned by Diodorus, another high priest of the El god. Lysimachus said this happened 1700 years ago, and that's from Against Apion. Lysimachus probably lived in the 1st century BC, which would put the Exodus around 1700 BC. This date does not take into account any overlap of reigns. So you see that they can skew dates here. It's just crazy. It should be noted that Syncellus quotes Manetho as saying that Joseph went into Egypt as a slave in the 4th year of Apophis and rose to power in the 17th year of the reign, Manetho, 1940. From Josephus, one can learn that Jacob went into Egypt about the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period, 1780 BC. That Josephus says that Jacob went into Egypt the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period, 1780 BC. Identifies the Hyksos and the Jews, that's from Against Apion. And the great exodus from Egypt was the expulsion of the Hyksos around 1570 to 50 BC. Josephus counted the 430 years from Abraham's entrance into Canaan excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Canaan to the Exodus, and 405 years from the birth of Isaac to the Exodus. I just think it's interesting to hear mostly what these different perspectives, these different historians actually say about the Exodus. So, such as the fact that they were actually possibly exiled and because they had some disease or something, but other perspectives will say something actually different about that. So, like that it represents something. So, let's just scroll down a little bit. Excuse me, I don't know if I can keep reading. Let's just keep trying. So, we have the birth of Abraham. You can look at this table here if you want. I'm not going to read it. Now let's skip to the Seder Olam Rabbah. Seder Olam means Book of the Order of the World. Was that like the Book of the New World Order? No, I don't know. It was written by Jose ben Halafta, who died about 160 AD. The oldest Jewish chronicle we have, that's the oldest, 160 AD. So that was after Jesus. Was later updated in Seder Olam Zota in the 18th century AD. On the next page is Table 2 with a summary of dates. Finnegan, that's source. Note that there are only 400 years from the birth of Isaac to the Exodus and 405 years in Josephus. I don't know if I want to know this. Dates from the creation of the world to the Exodus. It seems that Josephus follows the LXX, while Seder Olam Rabbah is, of course, going to follow the Masoretic text, because clearly this is why rabbis were writing stuff. Follows, oh yeah, of course. And it actually says that Olam Rabbah follows the Masoretic text. And of course, from the Exodus to the first temple is 480 years, and from the first temple to the second temple, and I'm not interested in that right now. Excuse me. The actual time between the first and second temple is about 430 years. There's an additional 50 years overlap, not looking at dates right now. Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees is the supposed account of events from creation revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. Events are dates according to their Jubilee year. So it's part of the cycles. It tells you about the cycles. There are many ages that we have experienced, and the zodiac reveals all that, which is in the Bible. Let's just keep reading. The Exodus happened 2,410 years after the creation of the world. Compare this with Seder Olam Rabbah, which says 2,448 years from the creation, and Josephus, who says 4,000. According to the Book of Jubilees, Adam stayed 8 years in Eden, which leaves 2,000 years. Not looking at that Book of Jubilees defends this. I'm not as interested in the dates as I am what an overview of some of the variances between the histories of the Exodus and the way they are, just kind of seeing the difference here. You can look at this table. It shows the differences in the dates that each historian gives. So each history. Let's go to Pseudo-Philo. Pseudo-Philo, Biblical Antiquities, traces biblical history from Adam to David. The date of this writing is probably around the time of Christ. Pseudo-Philo, so I'm not interested in that right now. Demetrius is the earliest datable Jewish author who writes in Greek around the 3rd century BC. There are 6 fragments of his writings. 5 of fragments are preserved in Eusebius' book, Preparation of the Gospel. One other fragment is found in Clement of Alexandria's book, Stromata. Demetrius' chronology reflects the work of the Septuagint, written a century earlier. So, yeah, at least. So, I think mostly here I'm really liking seeing that there are so many different views on these dates of the Exodus and even the creation. It's just like putting a lot of different information here that is interesting to me. It helps me to kind of connect the dots with what are real, just a more balanced perspective from all different parts of the world, I guess, I think. Eupolemus, I'm not sure if I want to read about his source, but I see that all of these sources have histories that you can go down these rabbit holes and look up what each history says about many more things about it than just the dates. Whether they were exiled from Egypt, or whether they had a disease, or what it had something to do with some schisms there theologically, I think, mostly. But we're just gonna keep putting this together. So I'm gonna scroll down. So Eupolemus was a Jewish writer who composed a book about the history of Israel from Moses to Solomon prior to the 1st century BC. There are only 5 fragments. Did we already read this? I think we did. Clement, each of these fragments are in different books that have to quote Eupolemus, most likely because they probably burned his writings too. So you have to read other people's stuff to get his history. I'm not going to go into that. Artapanus was a Jewish writer, probably between the 2nd and the 3rd century BC. 3 fragments are preserved by Eusebius. Artabanus probably was writing to counteract some of the charges of Manetho, who said Manethos were also burned. You have to read other quotes to get his history. Who said Moses invaded Egypt. Artabanus says that the Arabs plundered Egypt. This may reflect the account of the Jews despoiling the Egyptians in Exodus 3:22 and 12:36. So that's really important to me to read more about that source. In fragment 3, it says, Artabanus says in his On the Jews that when Abraham Joseph had died and his son Memsasthenoth, and also the king of the Egyptians, his son Palmanethes succeeded to dominion, the latter treated the Jews badly. First he built Sais and founded the temple there. Is that like Set or Satan? Then he established the shrine at Heliopolis. Now Sais might not be, I don't know, I'm just guessing. This man begat a daughter, Merce, like Mary's, whom he betrothed to a certain Chenephrez, who was king over the regions beyond Memphis. For at that time there were many kings of Egypt. Since she was barren, she adopted the child of one of the Jews and named it Moses. So Chenephrez, was it she? Was the king over the regions beyond Memphis? Interesting. The phrases king over the regions beyond Memphis and at that time there were many kings of Egypt seems to best describe the Hyksos period. The Hyksos only controlled Egypt as far as Memphis, Lower Egypt. Other kings ruled over Upper Egypt. Sais equals Tanis or avarice. King Chenephrez is probably the 25th king in the Turin Papyrus, 1730 BC, in probably, fourth of the 13th dynasty, Manetho. So that's from Manetho. Artabanus' description of the first plague of Egypt is due to the flooding of the Nile. So we have Artabanus saying that was just some scientific thing where, the flooding of the Nile, who knows how that happened. He says, proceeding a little, he struck the Nile with the rod. The river became flooded and deluged all Egypt. From that time also its inundation takes place. The water became stagnant and stank and destroyed the creatures that lived in rivers, and the people perished from thirst. Interesting. That would be according to Artabanus. Artabanus also relates two different views of the crossing of the Red Sea. He says, now the Memphites say that Moses was familiar with the countryside and watched for the ebb and tide, and he conveyed the multitude across through the dry sea. But the Heliopolitans say that a divine voice came to Moses to strike the sea with his rod and divide it. When Moses heard, he touched the water with the rod, and thus the flowing water separated, and the host went through a dry path. That's according to Charlesworth. So I guess you can find Charlesworth quoting Artabanus. There is an interesting parallel between Alexander the Great crossing the Pamphylian Sea. Josephus says the Pamphylian Sea retired and afforded them, Alexander and his army, a passage through itself when they had no other way to go. 1830. 61. Callus then wrote how the Pamphylian Sea did not only open a passage for Alexander, but by rising and elevating its waters, did pay homage as its king. From Josephus. Very interesting. Arian comments. He, Alexander, himself conducted those that were with him by the seashore. This road is impassable at any other time than when the north wind blows, but if the south wind prevail, there is no passing by the shore. Now at this time, after strong south winds, and north wind blew, and that not without the divine providence, and afforded him as easy and quick passage, according to Josephus and Arian. So you have to get Arian's comments through Josephus as well, and he also says it's Alexander the Great. Strabo also writes about Alexander the Great's crossing by saying, there is a mountain called Climax, which adjoins to the Sea of Pamphylia, leaving a narrow passage on the shore, which in calm weather is bare, so as be passable by travelers. But Alexander fell into the winter season, and committing himself chiefly to fortune, he marched on before the waves retired. And so it happened that they were a whole day in journeying over it, and were under water up to the navel. That's according to Josephus, quoting Strabo. Another one you have to read other people quoting it, because, of course, those writings are not available. They're burned or something, or disappeared. There is another parallel in the Assyrian annals of Sargon that says, But I, Sargon, led my army over the Tigris and the Euphrates at the peak of the flood, the spring flood, as if it be dry ground. It is interesting to note that Josephus refers to the crossing of the Pamphylian Sea as proof that God can part the sea. If it is his will, it was not just a strange accident. According to Josephus, or is it Sargon, excuse me, a parallel in the Assyrian annals. Okay. Well, this is really interesting. Testament of Moses. The Testament of Moses is a farewell exhortation given by Moses to Joshua just before his death. It prophesied the history of Israel from their entrance into Canaan to the end times. The most probable date for the text is the 1st century AD. The farewell speech of Moses to Joshua is said to be 2,500 years before the creation of the world. Okay, from Charlesworth. This is close to the Seder Olam, which gives the date of 2488 for the death of Moses, which implies that the writer of the Testament of Moses was following the Masoretic text. That's quite obvious. And that the 400 years covers the time in Canaan as well as Egypt. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in a cave in 1947 by a shepherd who was searching for a stray goat, right? In 1949, excavation began in the cave, and later 10 more caves were discovered. In Cave 4 alone, 15,000 fragments were found from 500. Anyway, we have lots of stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then that's all of these are from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we could read them all. Not sure if I want to. I think I'm going to end it here. And if anyone wants me to read the rest, let me know. Otherwise, I don't know if I will. Or maybe I just will and not record it. I don't know if this is interesting enough for anyone, but it's kind of cool to me to see these different versions of history according to different historians. And it's been fun. It's been enlightening. I really enjoy this, and I appreciate anyone who wants to join me in nerding out over biblical history. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.